In the shadowed corridors of ancient Jerusalem, there existed a name that could not be spoken, a figure erased from sacred texts, a teacher whose words were rewritten, whose legacy was buried beneath centuries of silence. They didn't just forget him, they made sure you would never know he existed. What if everything you were told about the past was a carefully constructed lie? The scrolls don't lie, but they were hidden for a reason. In the depths of rabbinical literature, in texts the world was never meant to see, there exists a parallel story, a forbidden narrative about a man called Yeshu, not Jesus of Nazareth, as the church would have you believe, but Yeshu ben Pandera, a sorcerer, a deceiver, a student who learned the secret names of God and used them to perform miracles that shook the foundations of the temple itself. The Talmud speaks his name in whispers. Centuries of Jewish scholars recorded his existence, then watched as Christian scribes tried to erase every trace. They burned manuscripts. They rewrote histories. They turned a complex, controversial figure into a sanitized Messiah that empires could worship. But the original story, the one written in Aramaic and Hebrew, the one passed down in hushed voices through generations of rabbis, that story tells a different tale entirely. Yeshu was not born in Bethlehem. The ancient sources place him a century earlier, during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus. His mother was Miriam, a hairdresser, and his father, according to the texts that survived inquisitions and book burnings, was a Roman soldier named Pandera. This was not the virgin birth of Christian mythology. This was scandal. This was shame. This was a child born outside the bounds of Jewish law, who would grow to challenge everything his people held sacred. He studied in the temple. The texts confirm this. He was brilliant, hungry for knowledge that others feared to touch. But brilliance alone does not make a Messiah. It was what he did with that knowledge that made him dangerous. The forbidden tradition says he entered the Holy of Holies, the most sacred chamber where only the high priest could tread. And there he learned the Shem HaMeforash, the explicit name of God, the name that held the power of creation itself. With this stolen knowledge, he performed wonders. He healed the sick, he made the blind see, he raised the dead. But these were not miracles in the eyes of the Sanhedrin. These were acts of sorcery, magic derived from sacred words that should never have been spoken by human lips. The rabbis who recorded his story did not call him blessed. They called him a practitioner of forbidden arts, a man who led Israel astray. The trial came swiftly. The Talmud records it in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that later authorities tried desperately to scatter. Yeshu was brought before the court, accused of sorcery and leading the people into idolatry. 5 disciples stood by him. The texts name them, though their names were changed in later Christian retellings. He was not crucified by Pontius Pilate, as the Gospels claim. He was stoned to death according to Jewish law, then hanged on a tree on the eve of Passover. His body was not resurrected, it was buried in disgrace. But here is where the story becomes truly dangerous. Here is where the ancient rabbis recorded something that would later be suppressed with violence. Yeshu's followers did not disappear. They continued his teachings in secret, forming cells throughout Judea and beyond. They claimed he had indeed risen, that he had transcended death through the power of the divine name he possessed. The Jewish authorities fought to contain this heresy, but it spread like fire through dry grass. Then came the transformation. A man named Paul, a Pharisee who never met Yeshu in life, began preaching a version of the story that bore little resemblance to the rabbinical accounts. He moved the timeline. He changed the parentage. He transformed a convicted sorcerer into the Son of God. He took a story rooted in Jewish lore and scandal and rebuilt it as a cosmic drama of salvation. The Roman Empire, desperate for a unifying religion, embraced this new narrative. They had the power to make it official truth. The Jewish texts that contradicted this story became targets. The Toledot Yeshu, the counter-gospel that preserved the older tradition, was banned, burned, destroyed wherever Christian authorities found it. Rabbis who taught the original story were persecuted. Synagogues that held these manuscripts were raided. Century by century, the alternative narrative was pushed further into the shadows until most of the world forgot it ever existed. But the texts survived, hidden in genizahs, buried in desert caves, preserved by communities that refused to let the truth be completely erased. They waited in darkness, these forbidden scrolls, holding a story that threatened the very foundation of Western civilization. A story that said the Messiah was a myth built on the bones of a sorcerer who stole the name of God. The church fathers knew about these texts. They had to. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, directly addressed the Jewish claims about Yeshu ben Pandera. He didn't deny their existence. He called them lies, slander, the desperate fabrications of a people who rejected their own salvation. But his very defensiveness reveals the truth. These weren't obscure rumors. These were widespread accounts, documented traditions that posed an existential threat to the emerging Christian narrative. Justin Martyr, debating with a rabbi named Trypho, confronted the same problem. The Jews had their own records, their own testimonies about who this man really was. Justin couldn't simply ignore them. Instead, he did what the church would do for centuries afterward. He reframed the narrative. He claimed the Jewish sources were corrupted by hatred, blinded by their refusal to accept the obvious truth of Christ's divinity. But read his arguments carefully, and you see the cracks. You see a man fighting against a story that refused to die. The Talmud was targeted for this very reason. In the 13th century, Christian authorities in France put the Talmud itself on trial. Thousands of manuscripts were burned in Paris, flames consuming centuries of accumulated wisdom. The official reason was that it contained blasphemies against Christ. The real reason was simpler and far more dangerous. It contained a different story. It preserved a memory that contradicted the official history the church had spent 1,000 years constructing. The passages about Yeshu were censored, redacted, removed from editions published in Christian lands. Jewish printers, forced to operate under church supervision, learned to omit the dangerous sections entirely. They left blank spaces in the text, gaps where forbidden knowledge once lived. Scholars knew what belonged there, but they couldn't print it without risking their lives and their communities. The silence became its own kind of testimony. Yet even in censored form, even with the gaps and the careful omissions, the texts whispered their truth. Medieval rabbis developed codes, ways of referring to the forbidden passages without explicitly naming them. They created layers of interpretation, commentaries that spoke in riddles to those who had the knowledge to understand. The story survived in fragments, in marginal notes, in oral traditions passed from teacher to student in locked rooms after dark. The Dead Sea Scrolls complicated everything. When those clay jars were opened in the caves of Qumran, scholars found a Judaism far more diverse, far more complex than anyone had imagined. Multiple Messiah figures, competing interpretations of prophecy. Communities that had broken away from temple authority, preserving their own texts and traditions. The neat narrative of a unified Judaism rejecting a clear Messiah suddenly looked impossibly simplistic. Among those scrolls, researchers found no mention of Jesus. None. A community obsessed with messianic prophecy, living in the very time and place where Christ supposedly walked, and they wrote nothing about him. They recorded their beliefs in exhaustive detail, but the central figure of Christian history appears nowhere in their extensive library. Either he was irrelevant to them, or the timeline itself was wrong, shifted by later editors to fit a narrative that served political rather than historical truth. The Gospel of Matthew betrays the tension. It addresses Jewish objections directly, almost desperately. The virgin birth narrative exists specifically to counter the Pandera story, to sanctify a parentage that Jewish sources called illegitimate. The resurrection account includes details about guards at the tomb, about Jewish priests bribing them to lie about the body being stolen. Why include these details unless there were widespread alternative explanations that needed to be suppressed? The gospel itself is evidence of the counter-narrative it tries to bury. Archaeological evidence adds another layer of doubt. Nazareth, the supposed hometown, barely existed in the 1st century. Recent excavations suggest a tiny settlement, perhaps a few dozen people at most. Not the kind of place that produces a figure who would reshape world history. The locations described in the Gospels don't match the geography. The timeline of Roman governance contains inconsistencies. The entire historical framework wobbles when you examine it closely, as if the story was constructed backward from a desired conclusion. The Council of Nicaea in 325 didn't just standardize Christian doctrine, it weaponized narrative. Constantine needed unity in his fracturing empire, and he needed it built on a foundation that couldn't be questioned. Bishops gathered, debated, voted on what would be considered true. Books were canonized. Others were declared heretical and ordered destroyed. The Jesus they created that day was designed for empire, scrubbed clean of his Jewish context, transformed into a cosmic figure that transcended the messy particularities of history. But empires fall, and their carefully constructed truths fall with them. The manuscripts they tried to burn survived in unexpected places. The Cairo Geniza, a repository of discarded Jewish texts, preserved fragments of the Toledot Yeshu that had vanished everywhere else. Scholars in the 19th century began piecing together the suppressed narrative, realizing that Jewish communities had maintained their own memory of events, a memory that contradicted church teaching at every essential point. Modern scholarship tries to split the difference, suggesting both accounts contain truth and mythology, that we can never know what really happened 2,000 years ago. But that comfortable ambiguity serves those in power. It allows the dominant narrative to remain dominant, unchallenged by texts that were literally burned to preserve Christian authority. The question isn't whether both sides have valid perspectives. The question is why one perspective required centuries of violence to maintain its dominance. The name Yeshu itself became a weapon. Jewish sources continued using it, a subtle act of resistance. It wasn't just a variant of Yeshua. Some scholars suggested it was an acronym, a curse hidden in plain sight. Yamak Shemo Vezikro, may his name and memory be obliterated. Every time a rabbi spoke that name, he was invoking ancient judgment, maintaining a tradition of rejection that no amount of persecution could fully silence. The truth hides in plain sight, recorded in texts that survived against impossible odds. A sorcerer, not a savior, a scandal, not a miracle, a story rewritten by those who conquered the land where it happened, then exported that rewritten version as universal truth. The gods didn't hide this knowledge. Men did. Men with armies and fires and the power to decide what future generations would be allowed to remember. Now you know what they tried to erase. The question is what you'll do with that knowledge.